Shopify presents cool sheets from aha to
I suffered from the wrong kind of hot in bed, heat-induced insomnia. That was my aha moment. Bed sheets that keep you cool. Then I thought, how do I even sell bed sheets? That's when I had the idea that made it all possible, signing up on Shopify.
This is Possibility, powered by Shopify. Sign up for a free trial at shopify.com/offer22. Shopify.com/offer22.
A massive new warehouse is coming to Northeast Portland in an area that's already choked with diesel pollution. It also happens to be just across a major street from a high school with one of the most diverse student populations in the state. I'm Andrew Thien, and this is Beat Check with the Oregonian. Up next, Gosia Wozniacka, environmental justice reporter for the Oregonian and OregonLive. Gosia joined the paper in recent weeks, but you may recognize her byline. She covered immigration and Latino affairs for the paper from 2006 to 2010, and has worked for a number of outlets since then. We talked about environmental justice, why she focused on one project in Northeast Portland, and what it says about the broader effort in Portland to focus on equity and just how far we have to go. Here's that conversation. Gosia, thanks for joining the show and welcome back to the Oregonian.
Thank you.
So you rejoined the paper as an environmental justice reporter. And before we hop into examining your latest story, can you just explain what environmental justice is and why you wanted to pursue this specific beat?
Yeah, of course. So environmental justice at the basics is about how climate change and legacy environmental issues impact vulnerable communities. And when I say vulnerable communities, I mean communities of color, indigenous communities, immigrants, refugees, and also low-income people and seniors.
So that's a nice setup to your first big, what we call in the business, enterprise piece. A piece with some meat on it that's a really interesting story in our community. Can you tell us about how a distribution center in Northeast Portland got on your radar and why you wanted to do this specific story?
Yeah, so I first heard about a warehouse coming in into the Parkrose neighborhood from Commissioner Jayapal in Multnomah County. Mm-hmm. And I thought that it would make for a good story because it's an area that already is surrounded by industry. It's hemmed in by 205 and I-84. So it's an area with a lot of pollution, and it's in outer Northeast Portland, where most of the people are low income, where half of the population is people of color, and there's a large percentage of immigrants as well in that community. So it's what's known as an overburdened community. There's a US EPA definition around that, but it's basically a community of color, a low-income community that already has a high burden of pollution.
And obviously the Parkrose piece of that, there's Parkrose High School, which is kind of where in relation to this piece of property that you wrote about?
Yeah, so that was the other interesting thing about this proposed warehouse is that it's on the former Kmart lot. Some folks may be familiar with that Kmart store because it was around for about 50 years. And that property is directly across from the fields of Parkrose High School. Parkrose Middle School is pretty close by. On the other side of the Kmart property are several apartment housing complexes where a lot of low-income folks and seniors live. So it's in a very residential part of Argay Terrace. It's not on the other side of the tracks in Sandy Boulevard, where typically the industrial zone is located. It's actually on the residential side.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that because this is an area of town, there's a cluster of industrial warehouse uses for miles, right? I mean, it's close to the airport and
exactly.
You've got those big thoroughfares. Is that kind of that's why we see that type of business out there?
Yeah, and that area where the Kmart is, it used to be zoned commercial, but it was rezoned by the city a few years ago to light industrial / employment. So it's they rezoned it to attract more industry to that area. But it's because it's already close to the industrial zone.
Okay, so the Kmart had been closed for a number of years by this point, right? And kind of came into Portland's consciousness recently due to it being, I guess, for lack of a better word, like the arena for a clash between, Proud Boys and other, counter protesters, right?
Exactly. So that lot has been empty since 2018 when the Kmart was shuttered. And since then, it was the stage for that clash between Proud Boys and anti-fascists. It also served as a COVID-19 vaccine clinic and also was a space for Parkrose High School students when one of their classmates brought a loaded gun to school, and that's where they gathered on that lot. So it's had a few occasional uses during the time that it was that the store was closed, but other than that, it's been pretty much empty, desolate, and waiting for the next idea.
So that next idea you wrote about is this distribution center. Who's behind it, and why is this something that school officials and some neighbors are worried about?
Yeah, so it's the property itself is owned by something that's called RFC Joint Venture, which is actually part of a New Jersey development company called Garden Homes. And Garden Homes is owned by a very wealthy family, the Wilf family, including Minnesota Vikings owner Zygmunt Wilf. So it's got some interesting ownership, and
no kidding.
Garden Homes and the Wilf family are leasing that property to Prologis. And Prologis is a San Francisco-based warehouse developer. It's one of the largest warehouse developers in the world. So it's kind of a big company. And Prologis already has a bunch of warehouses around Portland, so they're not new to our city.
Okay, so your piece is really fascinating because it delves into not just the environmental aspect, which we'll get to as well here momentarily, which obviously is why you wrote about it as the environmental justice reporter. But these types of facilities are really popping up all over the place, right? And that's because people are sitting at home ordering stuff online.
Right. Yeah, there's a real boom for warehouses because of the growth in online shopping. So we're all kind of responsible for it. But these warehouses, they want to be kind of close to residential areas because they're delivering goods to our doors. So I think it's definitely a trend. And there's been a lot of these going in around the country.
So what's the issue here? Why are people frustrated about this specific proposal?
Yes, so I need to answer that question that you asked before. So, as you mentioned, both the school district and neighbors are pretty concerned about the proposed warehouse, and that's because, for one, there's already a lot of traffic in that area. It's, as I mentioned, several schools are nearby. And so there's kids walking through the intersections. They come across right next to the warehouse. There's a gas station, several fast food joints where the kids come and buy their lunch during their lunch periods. They walk to school and back home. And again, these are already very busy intersections, and the warehouse would be bringing more trucks to that area, very large trucks likely. It would add to the traffic and safety issues that this neighborhood already is experiencing. And these trucks would add more diesel pollution to an area that already has a ton of diesel pollution because of the freeways and the industry that surrounds it. So both the traffic and the pollution are a major concern to the community and to the school officials.
So traffic, obviously, this is 122nd Avenue. This is a big thoroughfare on both sides of I-84. It's wide and the school is right there. So this is both a pedestrian safety issue as well as a pollution issue, as you mentioned.
Exactly. And the sad thing is that a lot of people don't seem to even know about this proposal. I went to the Hidden Oaks apartments, which are right next door to the former Kmart. And literally there's like a wall that separates the apartments from the former store. And I knocked on doors and talked to people who were outside, and not a single person knew about the warehouse proposal. Partly this is because the Prologis didn't have to notify anybody about this proposal. So it's only by complete sheer chance that one of the community members who's on the neighborhood association at Argay Terrace looked up, whether there were any forthcoming developments, and she saw this and alerted other people. So, the regular person who lives at the apartment housing complex has no idea this is coming, basically, right next to them.
Wow. And is that typical for developments like this, or is that unusual that there's no, prior notice needed?
So Prologis actually didn't have to notify neighbors. Usually when development meets all development standards, it doesn't need a land use review. And so that does not trigger neighbor notifications, which are typically required with land use reviews.
Yeah. So I guess to say it simply, this is allowed. The city, under current rules, you can build a massive warehouse, across the street from a high school in this case, because the underlying rules in Portland, zoning and regulatory legalese say, hey, that's A-okay.
Yes. The Prologis, I do want to be clear, Prologis is following all the rules that are currently set out by the city.
Yeah, exactly. So how do clean air advocates, school officials, and others who are frustrated about that, how do they view this situation? Because, like you said, the city talks about equity a lot being a major focus. And here it is. There's a project that will bring, dozens of diesel polluting vehicles into a neighborhood. And that's perfectly fine. I mean, what's been the response to all those facts on the ground?
Yeah, so I think that became a focus for my article because I realized that, the city has had these equity goals and statements for a few years now. They're baked into the city's comprehensive plan, into the city's climate action plan, into several other plans. And they clearly state that, the city has a history of racist land use planning that negatively impacted communities of color with negative environmental impacts. And the city should not repeat this type of decision making. In fact, the city should strive to not overburden communities that already bear a disproportionate burden of pollution.
What is the city's response to that? Because you spoke to people both in the Bureau of Development Services, that's kind of the city bureaucratic agency that oversees permitting and things of that nature, as well as the folks over in the planning division that look more at it's planning and sustainability, right? It's baked into the name of the agency, where they're supposed to be looking at long range plans and how it affects marginalized communities is part of their mission. What do they have to say about this?
Yeah, so folks in the bureau that approves the building permits were pretty clear. They said they don't have any discretion. They're just following the law, basically. They're following the zoning code, and that zoning code is written by another bureau, the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. So I really focused on that bureau, but since they're responsible for writing the zoning or rewriting the zoning code, and I asked them, why is it that this warehouse is kind of a model example of the type of community that your equity goals say you should protect from further harm, and yet there is absolutely no discretion to stop this kind of warehouse proposal from going forward. There's absolutely nothing that can be done in this case. It just seemed like there was a big discrepancy between the equity aspirations and the actual application, the practice, that there was really no application or practice. There's really no regulation at this point. And when I spoke to the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability, its deputy director, admitted pretty much that that was the case, that the city has these goals, but there's nothing behind them at this point. There's no zoning, no regulations, no requirements for developers, nothing to put them into action on the ground. And the city said that they are working on, in the future, having such regulations and perhaps changing zoning code to be able to have leeway when it comes to development in such communities, but they're at the very, very early stages of that. They're basically researching what other cities have done and what could be useful for Portland, what Portland could potentially adopt to make this work. But like I said, they're still at the very early stages. They don't have a timeline for when they would change, zoning code.
It goes beyond just all those issues, though, Gosia, right? I mean, this was actually a financial win for Prologis because this area right around Sandy and 122nd, where this Kmart used to be, is part of a enterprise zone. Can you describe what that is for the uninitiated? We've talked about it here on the podcast a few times, but it's a good thing if you're a property owner.
So that area was added to an enterprise zone a few years ago because basically the city felt like it wanted to add more jobs. And an enterprise zone has some tax breaks. So in this case, the company would receive tax breaks for 5 years for bringing jobs. And this is a mechanism that basically makes development more attractive to companies, but perhaps not to the local residents.
Yeah, no kidding. Well, let's talk about some of those residents. Can you talk about one man you spoke to? That's Jacob Clausek, and kind of how he views this development?
Yeah, so Jacob Clausek, when I knocked on doors at Hidden Oaks, he opened the door and he was very talkative. He has 3 kids, and he said one of his kids has potentially a form of long COVID, respiratory issues, basically, has coughing. And he was really concerned about the warehouse pollution because he said that might further aggravate the respiratory issues of his son. He also said that his kids walk to school every day, and so he was concerned about the additional pollution. He's actually somebody who grew up in that neighborhood in Argay Terrace, and he said the pollution has gone up significantly, and he really felt like it was something that the city would approve in a neighborhood like Argay Terrace, but would never let happen in more wealthier inner city neighborhoods in inner Portland.
So let's go back to just the very essence of diesel particulates. Like, what does that do to the human body? And how are we faring overall in the Portland area in terms of curbing those types of emissions?
Yeah, so I mean, diesel is very, very toxic. It's a carcinogen. You've probably seen the black soot that comes out of some cars, but it can cause a number of diseases, from childhood asthma attacks to respiratory diseases to cancer. So it's very harmful, and it's especially harmful to kids who take a lot more breaths than adults do. So they're just breathing in a lot more of this stuff than adults. And the Portland metro area has the highest diesel concentrations in Oregon. So it's been a standing issue for many years here, really, and one that the state really has not addressed in any plausible way.
And again, to highlight the issue here with the Parkrose School District, there's 3,000 students in the district, and 70% of those students are non-white.
That's right. 70% of the students are not white, and all of the students receive free lunch because the poverty rates are so high in the district. Then it's surrounded by freeways, and there are kids who are playing outside on those fields right across from the proposed warehouse. They've got all their sports teams playing outside, so they would be breathing that pollution every day potentially.
As you reported, a Portland State University researchers study found that diesel pollution is 4 to 6 times higher than Oregon's, I guess, healthy benchmark in and around that area, and that's before this project comes in.
That's right. Yeah, one of the researchers on that team, Vivek Shandas, whom I interviewed, is a professor at PSU. He told me that area is bathed in diesel already. So you're adding more on top of what's already there. There's places in Portland that have very high diesel concentrations, and it just something that congregates around freeways, around industry, around areas that have a lot of trucks and non-road equipment. But it happens that communities of color and low-income people tend to live in those areas. So it just impacts them much more than it does other folks.
So what else would you hope that people take away from this story?
I think there's a few things that I hope people take away. I mean, on the fundamental level, I hope that it makes people think about how disproportionate the impact of pollution is, that not everybody has the same impact because of where they live. And, if you're poor and you live in Parkrose or Argay Terrace, you don't exactly have the means to say like, oh, I don't like this neighborhood anymore, I'm just going to move somewhere else. Like you're kind of stuck where you are. So, it's something that really impacts people's health. And even though, it may be hard to prove exactly where it's coming from because it's air pollution, it's not a factory. That's sited in a specific area. A warehouse by itself doesn't produce any emissions. It's the trucks that are attached to it that come with it that do.
Yeah. And I think there's one other piece that, I don't know that we hit on because this is maybe we did. It's been a long day, but redlining, which is another byproduct, or actually not byproduct, it was baked into city documents. That played a factor here too, right? That, a lot of the reason that we have such denser minority communities in certain neighborhoods of the city is because they were legally forced out.
That's right. So minority communities in Portland, especially the Black community, they were not allowed into certain neighborhoods and forced out into other neighborhoods. And the neighborhoods where they ended up were then targeted for industrial development. But also there was disinvestment, so they didn't get trees, they didn't get sidewalks and other nice amenities. So they ended up with a neighborhood that's pretty industrial and doesn't have trees that give them shade during the hot summers or that sort of thing. So it's really something that shaped how neighborhoods look like today. And then, of course, in the Portland area, these neighborhoods have evolved over time. So, more low-income people, more immigrants and refugees move into communities that are affordable. And these communities that are surrounded by pollution, they're not very desirable. And so they tend to be more affordable. And so they're kind of magnets for people who can't afford to live anywhere else.
And I'm glad you brought up the lack of tree canopy, because that's something that the researcher, the professor you mentioned earlier, Vivek Chandas, something he's studied and I know and has written about as well. So these are heat islands. So this is also a heat island in this part of town. And not only that, to add another layer into this situation, there was a store that served the community there, and now that's been gone, and in its place is this, factory that serves others.
Yeah. And Vivek Chandas was really saying how cities need to do a little more reflection about how they're going to do this development in the future, because when you develop an area, that development stays there for, 50, 70, 100 years. It's not going to go away, even though in 100 years, our temperatures may be much higher than they are today. And Argay Terrace and Parkrose already are neighborhoods that are sort of part of this arc of heat in Portland, where temperatures are much, much higher than they are in, the sort of inner Portland neighborhoods that have tons of trees and a nice tree canopy. So, in Parkrose and Argay Terrace, it's predominantly roads, large apartment complexes, and industry, sort of low buildings, and all of those attract heat and accumulate heat. And so when there's a heat dome event, or when it's just, hot during the summer, then the temperatures there can be much, much higher than in other parts of Portland. And obviously putting in another warehouse, and kind of baking in that heat, for another 100 years is not going to help.
No, it's not. Well, Gosia, thank you so much for taking time to talk about this story. Is there anything else you'd want to say to listeners just about, obviously you're just getting started again here at the O, but just about what kind of stories you're going to be pursuing and how to reach you?
I'm hoping to be pursuing more reporting that tells the stories of neighborhoods, of local people and how they're being impacted by pollution, by climate change, and also by access to green infrastructure, housing, transportation, because we have a tendency to be sustainable in our city and to focus on these efficiencies and sustainability, but they're not always available to everybody. And I think part of my beat, part of environmental justice, is looking at who gets access to things. So who gets access to these efficient buildings, who gets access to good, clean, safe water, to a wonderful tree canopy, who gets access to healthy food, and who doesn't. And so I welcome readers to email me and contact me with any story ideas that have to do with local communities experiencing pollution burdens and also access issues. I'm also hoping to highlight positive stories, solutions in the neighborhoods, how local leaders are building programs for people to gain more access to green jobs, how we're building new types of affordable housing that do have these energy efficiency that can help communities of color, have good air filtration, have, AC in their homes, things that may seem pretty sort of standard, but at the same time, many people don't have access to them. So it's pretty key to write about them.
Well, I will share your email in the show notes, and thank you so much for your reporting and for taking time to talk about it.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to Beat Check with the Oregonian. I shared a link to Gosia's story and her email address if you have any questions or story ideas in the episode notes. If you like this show, give us a 5-star rating and review in Apple Podcasts. It really helps people find the show. And tell a friend. Help spread the word. The best way to support our journalism and stories like this one is with a subscription to Oregon Live. You can do that at OregonLive.com/pod support. Until next time.